All right, so we are back. I've got a new book from Jonah Barnes, The Lost Gems of Genesis, How Apocryphal Texts Proved Joseph Smith Fixed the Bible, which is going to be freaking awesome. So let's start right into it. This very first video is going to be all the extra stuff, because I know in his last book, he referenced all his sources and whether Joseph Smith had access to them. So I'm sure it'll be something similar. and right off the bat, we have classic, wonderful, humorous stuff. Akic no leg deminence. Microsoft spellcheck. Akic no leg deminence. Microsoft spellcheck. Yes, very good Akic no leg deminence. The contents, so the chapter headings, let's see here, there's a foreword, dramatis libri, which is probably the references, introduction, God's sons, God's grandson, the book of Eve, seed of the woman, Enoch 0, reboot, Abrahamic pudding, Lamb of God, Jacob's ladder, conclusion, an appendix, debunking Pan Enoch. So let's do that. So going from the back, they have about the author, about the publisher. They're short. About the publisher, Plain and Precious Publishing is a non-traditional publisher dedicated to publishing new and unconventional perspectives on ancient scripture and temple theology. You can see our growing catalog and buy books directly from us at plainandpreciouspublishing.com. That's sweet. Now about the author. This will be good. Historians estimate that Jonah Barnes crawled out of a glowing meteorite approximately 40 years ago. He grew up in rural Kansas like any ordinary human. He can run faster than a speeding bullet and leap entire buildings in a single bound. At least his kids think so. When Jonah isn't moonlighting as a masked crime fighter, he owns a food production business in Southwest Washington. He's married and has 6 little people who eat his food, steal his neckties, and occasionally paint his nails. Jonah is an enthusiastic member of the LDS Church and a producer at Ward Radio, a faithful LDS podcast. How cool. All right. Appendix. Debunking Pan Epic. Not Pan Epic. I've been saying that wrong. Pan Enoch. Look at you, you beautiful nerd. You flipped back here just to read this nerdy debunking of Pan Enoch. I like the cut of your jib. Here are 35 evidences of pre-1830 Enochian materials taken in reverse order. These are supposed to be the sources for Joseph Smith's 8,000-word Book of Enoch. And what's interesting about this is I suppose this will be referenced in there, but it's kind of a takedown of Dr. Townsend's attempt at discrediting the Book of Enoch that was produced by Joseph Smith. But I wanted to start with it because, well, it's extra material. It's fun. All right. Townsend ends his thesis in 1830, where R.R. Madden published a book called Musulman, Mussulman, Musulman, about his travels in the Near East, which mentions Enochian themes. But the footnote says neither passage features the prophet Enoch directly, on only other characters mentioning his name, such as had Enoch the astrologer been present, and in the name of Enoch, the father of magic, respectively. So anyways, from that book, Townsend does not mention that this book was still in draft form in May of 1830 in London, meaning this literary clue would have to have had gone from draft to publication to London to Philadelphia to Harmony, Pennsylvania in 1 month, back when it took a week just to typeset a book and a year to cross the ocean. This cannot have been a source for Joseph's Enoch. On the contrary, it is yet further evidence for Joseph's prophetic gift, which we will discuss shortly. The problem is worse than that, however. Enochian themes are all over the Book of Mormon, which was published in 1829, making the Musulman irrelevant. The Book of Mormon's publication was gossiped about 1,000 times more than the Musulman. Does the author suppose that Madden copied the Book of Mormon? Yes. Anyway. Also, in 1830, one essay published in Boston quotes the Epistle of Jude's reference to Enoch. But again, this essay contradicts Dr. Townsend's theory by saying, "What is contained in the Book of Enoch will probably never be known to the Christian world at large." The Christian world at large is just who must have known all about Enoch for Joseph to have absorbed it so effortlessly from the air around him. Number 3, flexing his muscles of brevity, Townsend states, "There were more references in English literature to First Enoch in 1828 and 1829, and in 1830 there were several significant publications. The dead ends in 1830 have been sorted. A. The significant reference in 1829 was made in a book annotating several epistles of the New Testament, including Jude." No one is surprised to learn that Jude refers briefly to the figure in Genesis called Enoch. This fallacy occurs again and again. Any mere mention of Enoch suddenly makes Enoch the central figure. Right. Since Jude refers to Enoch, everything discussing Jude invariably includes some call out to Enoch. But this example is typical in that the reference to Enoch is made in the footnote on the very last page of the 560-page book. Woo! The book erroneously names the apocryphal book the Prophecies of Enoch. Whoopsie! And B, in the 1828 mention of Enoch was written by one Henry St. John, Viscount Bolingbroke from Wiltshire, England, an obvious fan favorite among the peasant farmers of backwoods Pennsylvania. 4. But these several significant publications could never approach the world-famous personal letter written by an English cleric to the Archbishop Cashel in 1827. In this letter, the author said nothing of Enoch directly, only that he thought St. Jude probably regarded Enoch as significant. Ta-da! That's it. 4 down, 29 to go. Wow. So this is all the references from this Dr. Townsend, and I was going from this the latest and strongest, and now we're going backwards, and it's getting less and less significant. Anyways, number 5. Earlier that same year, National Gazette published this article mentioning the discovery of the Ethiopic Book of Enoch. None of the contents were published. Yep. In 1827, a book was published in London arguing about the canonicity of First Enoch. There's no evidence this book made it to America before 1829, let alone Harmony, Pennsylvania. Furthermore, the purpose of this book is to contend about the canonicity of the recently discovered Enoch, not to print and praise it. It does as much to cast doubt on the authenticity of Enoch as it does to support it, saying, "We must not, nevertheless, concede that it was ever invested with canonical authority." Lastly, the book contains disjointed and various quotations from the Ethiopian Enoch. Reverse engineering a book from this mess would be a feat enough to earn the title of a prophet. Number 7. The next two evidences from 1826 can be handled together because they both are silent on the contents of Enoch and argue that it's a forgery from Britain. That comes from S.S. Schumacher, An Elementary Course of Biblical Theology, translated from the works of professors, and secondly, Alexander Archibald in 1826, The Canon of the Old and New Testaments Ascertained, or Bible Complete in the Apocryphal and Unwritten Traditions. And so he leaves that in the footnotes. 8. Here, the author is pleased to report an explosion of popular and scholarly publications that either discussed or were dependent on First Enoch. An explosion! How big was the explosion? How many celebrity martyrs were killed in the blast radius? How many publications were there? 4, we're informed. A veritable flood of 2 whole pairs. Indeed, a pair of pairs, one could say. Let us embark on this journey to cover each and every one of these 4 bits of profit-ripping shrapnel from 1825 explosion of First Enoch. The first is a correspondence between 2 scholars in Boston having an argument about Sheol, Hades, Tartarus, and Gehenna. Our author is eager to point out that at one point in their correspondence, one scholar implies that both men had copies of Enoch in America. Then one of the men scolds his opponent for scarcely glancing at it. Oof. If professional Bostonian bookworms aren't aware of the contents, why would Joseph Smith be? Also, not a single character of First Enoch is printed. Another 1825 publication in Philadelphia by Thomas Horn merely mentions Enoch enough to call it spurious and a Grecian fable. Again, not a single character of the contents of First Enoch is printed. The third shockwave of 1825 was a letter to the editor contained in the Christian Observer magazine, printed in Boston, Massachusetts. The letter was relegated to the miscellaneous portion, 500 pages into the issue. Contents of First Enoch were so popular that the author has to explain to everyone just what the book is and give a summary of its contents. Quote, a series of visions respecting the fallen angels, their posterity, the giants, which occasioned the deluge, the mysteries of heaven, and the place of the final judgment of men and angels in several parts of the universe described as having been seen by the writer. Unquote. Not a character of First Enoch is printed. And lastly, the crown of the 1825 Enochian explosion. Explosion! If you know, you know. The works of Right Honorable Lord Byron, which, according to Townsend, quote, explicitly referenced First Enoch, unquote. How else things are referenced if not explicitly? This explicit reference is explicitly hidden in footnote number 302. Dude, the fact that Jonah Barnes went through and found where these references were so he can debunk them is pretty freaking amazing, because, I'm sorry, going through 500-page books to find the last footnote at the end of the page and then say, and that's what the author calls the central theme, or in this case, footnote number 302 in the Book of Enoch, preserved by the Ethiopians, is said by them to be anterior to the flood. And that's it. Oh, God, I sure hope he had something helping him search through this. Because if he had to do this back in the day before cataloging and computing and AI, that would be an absolute horrid mess of trying to find all this. But thankfully he does this for us, and we're just lucky that we can come along. But I'm grateful that he does these things. Anyways, wow. Number 9. Just before this devastating detonation, Thomas Tompkins' grandson published his granddad's a practical discourse upon the Epistle of Jude in 1823. The author assures us that this publication included an excerpt of the first couple chapters from First Enoch. In reality, of the 250-page, 108-chapter book of First Enoch, not a syllable can be found. Townsend never provides a page reference for his claim, so the mystery persists. Oof. Yeah. Number 10. And who could forget when several British newspapers, several meaning 2, announced the coming publication of Thomas More's 1823 The Loves of the Angels. The famous Derby Mercury newspaper quotes the Universal Dictionary of the Arts, when it announces Mr. Moore's new poem is founded on the apocryphal Book of Enoch, but this book was probably forged in the 2nd century. The Mahometans mentioned Enoch under the appellation of Edris or Idris, and recorded many fables concerning him, which is needless to mention. There was a dreadful gale at Margate on Thursday. Okay, oddly, Joseph Smith never mentions the gale at Margate. In 1822, Lawrence's translation finally hit the bookshelves in London. This is the first rendering of 1st Enoch in English. While not exactly what we have today, this translation was mostly complete, also completely out of Joseph Smith's reach in London. Number 12, in response to Lawrence's groundbreaking publication, one whole person wrote a review called Inquiry into the Truth and Use of the Book of Enoch. This inquiry breaks down most of the book and scrutinizes it from the perspective of canonicity. This would have been interesting to the 5s and 10s of British men who read the first page of it. Oof. At number 13, in 1821, the Maryland Gazette announced that Lawrence was almost finished with his translation. How does this explain Joseph's parallels to ancient documents again? In 1820, the Republican Compiler newspaper announced that someone was working on a translation of 1st Enoch. Not a word of it is mentioned, only that someone was working on one. Number 15, commenting on the Bible, in 1819, Adam Clarke dismissed 1st Enoch as a forgery by the sentiment and the style and the doctrine. T. Bentley wrote in 1815 that early Christians did not think 1st Enoch was divine. Robert Mayo called 1st Enoch certainly spurious and doesn't quote a word from it. One Charles Taylor mentions Enoch several times in Calmet's Great Dictionary of the Holy Bible because Enoch appears in Genesis, but the Ethiopian Book of Enoch only mentions as being of no authority and apocryphal. 19. In 1813, Elijah Parrish simply reprints what he's read in Taylor's commentary, warning that the apocryphal Book of Enoch had led several ancient authors into mistakes surrounding the history of the Bible. Townsend, number 20, Townsend also claims that another reference is made to 1st Enoch in December of 1811 issue of the Baptist magazine. There's only mention of Jude's reference to Enoch. Tertullian's mention of the Enoch and Genesis mentions... Tertullian's mention of Enoch and Genesis's mention of Enoch. The Ethiopian book in question is described as some writings which bore his Enoch's name, of which the Jews recorded a volume consisting of several thousand lines, called the Prophecy of Enoch. 21. Next one, William Cave makes reference to 1st Enoch in his book published in Philadelphia in 1810. Cave briefly argues that simply because Enoch is considered presently false and uncanonical doesn't mean that the Epistle of Jude is too. Once again, not a character from the mystery book is printed. Number 22, when the 8th volume of the 41-volume Universal Dictionary of the Arts was printed in Philadelphia in 1819, surely 13-year-old Joseph was enraptured to learn that some cite the Book of the Prophecies of Enoch, but that this book was probably forged in the 2nd century. Number 23, this same forgery sentiment was shared by George Prettyman in his Bible commentary printed in 1806. Number 24, Baptist Annual Register in London printed a discussion of the canonicity of Enoch on page 847 in its 4th volume. Again, across the ocean from Joseph, the article quotes what others have opined about 1st Enoch's authenticity, then likens it to the false traditions that Christ decried during his mortal ministry. In 1807, a British magazine in London called the Orthodox Churchman's Magazine published portions of 1st Enoch in English. It published parts of it in English. The magazine dismissed the text, carrying with it the most clumsy marks of monkish imposture and ignorance. Oh, that was their quote, was they dismissed the text as, quote, carrying with it the most clumsy marks of monkish imposture and ignorance. So, geez Louise, that would be 1807? God, all right, well, how old was Joseph Smith then? And how in the world? Anyway, in March of 1801, the monthly magazine or British Register published a letter to the editor, which our researcher tells us either mentioned or directly commented on First Enoch. And our researcher tells us it is in Volume 2 from 1801. There is no Volume 2 from 1801. Well, oh, our researcher isn't Dr. Townsend, I assume. March Monthly British Register published a letter to the editor, which our researcher tells us, quote, either mentioned or directly commented on First Enoch, unquote. Our researcher tells us it is in Volume 2 from 1801. There is no Volume 2 from 1801. Volume 2 was printed in 1797. But supposing he mistook the Roman numerals II for the number 2, we find that issue number 11 contains the relevant passage, kinda. The passage in question refers to, quote, the error of the first century, unquote, from which writers, quote, have fallen, unquote. These writers made foolish, quote, misinterpretations of the Book of Enoch, unquote, by supposing that, quote, semi-men pursued an intercourse with girls, unquote. It goes on to explain that, quote, sylphs and other elementary spirits are the real children of Elohim. In order to obtain an empire over the salamanders, it is necessary, unquote. Not a single character of First Enoch is here printed. Wow. Okay. Number 27. In the same issue, another writer supposes that First Enoch evidently discusses doctrines of the Last Judgment and the destructions of the world by fire and the salvation of the chosen righteous. Then Malachi's reference to the future coming of Elijah must be a corrupt reading of Enoch. Still, not a letter of First Enoch gets published here. Though still considered merely as Jewish mythology, at last someone actually included portions of the text, 1 Enoch 1, 1 through 2, 3, 6, 1 through 2 and 3, and then chapter 6, 1 through 13, and 10, and then chapter 14, 8 through 15, and 11, and chapter 22, 5 through 7. That is from Anonymous Concerning the Writings and Readings of Jude in Monthly Magazine, the British Register, Volume 2, Number 1, page 18 through 23. Citing a distant London publication called The History of the 70... Citing a distant London publication called The History of the 72 Interpreters. Whew. From 1719, Mr. Townsend immediately apologizes, saying it, quote, only offers a small glimpse to what was available about First Enoch in 18th and early 19th century English reading circles, unquote. It seems Dr. Townsend is referring to British scholar and Anglican priest Vicar Thomas Lewis and his translation, and how many, quote, English reading circles was, unquote, was Joseph Smith part of, or Lucy Mack Smith. And are we to simply trust that this is merely a, quote, small glimpse, or you'll be showing a larger glimpse also? Number 30, as early as 1602, one of Joseph Scaliger's published excerpts of the Greek text of First Enoch in Latin, 33, would mean something if Joseph Smith Jr. ever read Latin, but he didn't. So so far, out of all of these, which is 30 different apparent quotations by Dr. Townsend, there are 2 that actually have some information in it. But at the same time, when and where they were published was so far and so early in Joseph Smith's life, I don't think anyone would have known about it. And especially if common liturgical societies, whether it was Protestants or Methodists, well, Methodists are also Protestants. I'm trying to think, I'm not sure how big the Catholic Church was in, because that's kind of the closest Orthodox. Anglican or Catholic, although Anglican is also considered Protestant. Sorry, what I'm musing about is all the religions that would have been in America when Joseph Smith was young. I don't think any of them would have been discussing Enoch. If anyone, it is literally stuck to those who are really, really, really big theologists. And even for them, it would have been a dismissal footnote. And since very few publications had anything published in it at all, how in the world would it ever get into the ears of Joseph Smith? I mean, if anything, people would know Enoch from Genesis, where it just mentions his name, and like a verse or two, if that, and that's it. And so, anyways, number 31, our author, Dr. Townsend, assures us that the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, printed in 1712, quote, explicitly cites First Enoch and discusses many of its themes, unquote. Bruh, it doesn't. At all. Does he know we can just Google this stuff? Number 32, Codex Pseudographicus Veterius Testamenti was written in Latin in 1713, but eventually translated into English by William Whiston in 1727, a part of a collection of authentic records belonging to the Old and New Testament, page 199. This publication merely compiles commentaries that others have written and speculated about who Enoch might be and what Jude might be referring to. The 1727 translation includes pleadings by the author that if the, quote, magic, unquote, mentioned in the apocryphal books listing also Enoch, if that magic is consistent, then it is, quote, reason to believe, quote, they might not be forgeries. Aside from failing to instill much confidence, these tracts do not include much text from the actual text of First Enoch. The commentaries reference only chapters 6:1 and 10:2 of the Ethiopic Book of Enoch. The 1732 book alluded to Enoch, referring to previous Latin versions. And that was Mythology of the Fables of the Ancients, for that one. Number 34, in 1739, Antoine Bannier published the Mythology and Fables of the Ancients. Antoine calls the Enochian story heretical because it mentions giants and miscegenation between angels and men. God, that's a new vocabulary word, miscegenation. M-I-S-C-E, miscegenation. Because it's C-E-C-E, so miscegenation. Miscegenation between angels and men. Anyways, you can get by reference what that is. Townsend, number 35, Townsend points to the 1747 publication of An Universal History from the Earliest Accounts of Time, which mentions the rumored Book of Enoch as a manifest forgery. The author snorts, paragraph quote, that Enoch was a prophet and that some prophecy of his was preserved either in writing or by tradition, appears from a passage quoted thence by St. Jude. However, the piece under the title of the Scripture of the Prophecy of Enoch, which we have some fragments extant, is allowed to be a manifest forgery, though several of the fathers had a better opinion than it deserves. Unquote. Is this supposed to be evidence that everyone was excited about Enoch? And that's so very true. Number 36, 1752, John Jackson paraphrased Enoch and referred back to Senselus, quote, extracts, unquote. So he was just summarizing what was in that book. 37, a wild letter to the editors of the Universal magazine in 1768 denounces any rumors about some Enochian discoveries. Quote, as this book contains many fictions on these subjects, all the fathers considered it as apocryphal and not written by the patriarchs of Enoch. Unquote. no excerpts of Enoch are included. So it was just used to kind of stamp out any idea of that. And that was back in 1768. So, yeah, a little before the times that would be useful in any way. Number 38, the 1773 discovery of Enoch by James Bruce misses the point. If someone had truly discovered it and announced it, why would Joseph gamble on it now? Number 39, calling it a forgery, William Alexander's book in 1782 doesn't report a single word of Enoch either. Number 40, the next piece of evidence from 1783, when Samuel Hoole calls Enoch a forgery and prints a poem about Azazel, one of the fallen angels. No. So probably from the information about Azazel from those sources, he printed a poem from that. No matter, Townsend assures us, Hoole's poem shows a deep awareness of the contents of First Enoch and portrays the uneasiness of the relationships between fallen angels and their human wives. Great. Super. Joseph never mentions Azazel or any fallen angels. Yeah, that's true. Townsend declares victory in 1786, saying that a book printed in Ireland in 1786 proves the, quote, the widespread knowledge about, unquote, the Ethiopian Book of Enoch. So widespread, this book doesn't quote a word of it and calls it, quote, fiction, unquote. Woo! But why does Warren Skinner in 1830 lament that the contents of Enoch will, quote, probably never be known to Christian world at large, unquote? Does Dr. Townsend know about this publication? We know he does because he cited it in this very paper. In 1797, the Encyclopedia Britannica lists contemporary approaches or explaining the relationship between Jude 14 through 15 and First Enoch. Okay, great, I guess. Then in 1801, First Enoch 1 through 2, chapter 3, chapter 6, 1 through 13, chapter 10, chapter 14, 8 through 15, chapter 11, oh yeah, those quotes that were used earlier and such, and 32, 1 through 6. Yes, these are English translations, but why would Joseph have a British magazine, anonymously written? One article on the matter. How studied does one have to be to spelunk into every magazine published in English-speaking world? Did Joseph have a beta version of Google Scholar in his cabin? Which makes me wonder if that's how this Dr. Townsend got things, is he was just only looking up where Enoch is referenced, or even First Enoch is referenced from these materials, and just not actually reading the information. So really there was only 2, maybe 3 citations that actually had quotes from it. But again, even when those were quoted, it's like, where was it and who had it? Because it seems like when even other people were, I remember there being some sort of historical quotes about Joseph Smith putting forward the information as he was trying to translate the Bible, and having that section on Enoch from Abraham and Pearl of Great Price in Moses and Abraham and such, and them saying, hey, have you heard about this book of Enoch? He's like, no, but see, hey, the more this stuff comes out, the more that we stick to the Book of Mormon and what God gives us, he'll give us even more scriptures. So to me, that really also says he just wasn't aware, because, yeah, English publications, I mean, how deep did even modern day people have to dig to find this stuff? Do you think it was around when everyone thinks it's a forgery anyways? Why even mention it, right? I mean, let's take it this way. If you were a scholar and you had knowledge about in the Book of Enoch, first of all, most of the sources in here just say, well, it's a forgery, right? So you probably wouldn't actually have the contents of what was in it. And even if you did have the contents of what was in it, Let's say you're like a master scholar on top of everything in every publication, and you get a hold of the Book of Enoch, and you read it and you understand it. Your opinion at that time, through the lens of the Bible, and especially through orthodoxy and Orthodox religion, or through Protestantism even more, is that anything that's outside the canon of the Bible, it's just junk. And so any layperson coming by who's an uneducated farmer in upstate Pennsylvania, New York, if he starts asking about it, would you even care? Just don't worry. It would be, don't even worry about it. People would be so in the dark, the regular people would be so in the dark, they wouldn't even be asking about it in the first place. And even if someone did come and ask about it, it'd be along the lines of, oh, that's just the first thing is you give your conclusion on it when you have a conversation. Most people sit there and say, oh, this is just a work of bunko, who cares? Don't worry about it, right? It would only be if you were specifically getting into deep conversations with other people who would know about it in full already, you would actually discuss it. So just by pure psychological reasons, you can see that Joseph Smith wouldn't have access to it. And anyway, finally, in 1801, the first publication comes to America. The fragile hopes of anti-Mormons breathe a sigh of relief. Like nearly everything else, it isn't about Enoch, but about Jude, entitled, quote, Concerning the Writings and Readings of Jude, unquote. This is like a courtier reminding everyone he meets that he stands close to the king. He's not famous or relevant, but he's kind of close to someone who is. Jude ain't Enoch. So the 1801 falls flat. In 1806, the Orthodox Churchman's Magazine and Review published an article actually about Enoch, but in England. Townsend assures us that it was published to a, quote, broad audience, unquote. The author writes by, quote, assuming that all the journal's readers are familiar with the passage in Jude that referenced the prophecy of Enoch, unquote, and laments at his, quote, failed attempts to obtain a copy, unquote. Like everyone else, least of all little Joseph, the author had nothing like 1 Enoch in his possession. Some excerpts are provided, which are 1 Enoch 1, 1 through 9, 6, 1 through 8, and 4, 22, 5 through 7, and 32, 1 through 6. This article was also reprinted in February of 1808 in the Churchman's Magazine in New York, and Townsend might have saved us all time by focusing on these tiny excerpts and telling us how they explain the dozens of uncanny parallels, rather than dropping the dates and titles and hoping that that intimidates the readers of Joseph. Aha, see? So, there's all the reference that Dr. Townsend had. And here is what Jonah has to say on it. Dr. Townsend conceals another very bad assumption. However, Townsend makes a parallel mistake to the view of the Hebrew zealots. These devoted Jews recite to everyone that Joseph wasn't the first to imagine that Hebrews might have made it to America. While this rabbit hole might seem enticing at first, it distracts from the fact that Joseph produced a 269,000-word epic with complex doctrine, liturgy, and overlapping narrative. The miracle of the Book of Mormon isn't the idea that the Hebrews might have made it to America. Lots of guys wanted to put an engine on wheels, but only one of those dudes became Henry Ford. Similarly, Dr. Townsend thinks that the mere existence of Enoch, the whisperings about it, were enough to coagulate the story in Joseph's mind. It isn't the fact that people might have heard about Enoch, it's the meat inside Joseph's book that gives it strength. Merely saying, I also think there was a guy named Enoch, wouldn't be newsworthy. The book itself is a deep, complex, and supported by a myriad of ancient discoveries. Ironically, these critics accuse us of parallelism while snatching up PhDs for tripe like this. For the few readers who make it this far, thank you. This was a lot of work. Admittedly, it was also a lot of fun. It's amazing how intimidating a Gish Gallop like this one can look until you begin dissecting it. Like a dead frog, it twitches and spurts, but is ultimately hopeless and harmless. So it seems we end up here again, Some kid from New York spat out a perfectly viable Book of Enoch predicting literary and doctrinal elements yet undiscovered. Think of the time that could have been saved had we simply trusted Joseph in the first place. And I agree, honestly. Like, that's the most interesting thing about every time it comes to someone trying to take on the Book of Enoch or the Book of Mormon. Oh, it was, what was that book again? View of the Hebrews. Well, the View of the Hebrews was kind of a fictional thing, and it had to do with Romans coming to America and finding Hebrews there, which is entirely different. And you're just like, really? Really? You're going for that stuff. Anyways, I wanted to start with that because I am that nerdy guy that goes to the appendixes and stuff first. For example, when I was reading not Dune Imperium, but just Dune, the original Dune book, I read the glossary first because I'm like, okay, if they're going to be referencing this material, I should know it first. That was rough. That was kind of really boring, but I did get through the glossary of Dune first, at least but when I did read it, I think it did help because I could reference back to the glossary. Like, oh, I forgot that word. What's this? Quizataric character? What's the B'nai Gesserit? Yeah. So, pardon me indulging in these extracurricular activities. Let's actually get on with the front of the book. Throughout the book, you have QR codes. I'll try and show them so you can enjoy them, Pa. And then also forward, Mike Day. We'll get through the forward, and then we'll actually get into the library, I guess, next time, because it goes over his stuff. Well, if you'll bear with me, maybe let's get through that as well. And that way we can have all this extra stuff done. And that way, if you're nerdy like me, you can enjoy it. And then if you're not, you can just sit there and say, oh, okay, well, this was nice, but we'll get to the real meat of the book next time. All right, the foreword. The Lost Gems of Genesis. Mike Day. June 2nd, 2025. Somewhere classified. I first met Jonah not in person, but on page. His first book, Key to the Keystone, was given to me while I was in the middle of writing my dissertation on the Psalms. At the time, I was deep into research on the ancient use of the Psalms in temple worship and their influence on the message of the New Testament writers. Jonah's work immediately struck a chord. His argument that the material contained in the brass plates had many teachings that were removed by the editors of the Hebrew Bible was convincing. It was this missing material that was central to the message of so many of the Book of Mormon's prophets. In Jonah's book, Key to the Keystone, he proposed something that stayed with me, that the Book of Mormon prophets drew heavily from the brass plates, which contained much more than the modern Bible does today, perhaps even containing much of the extra-biblical literature that has been brought to light since it was published in 1830. It was an insight that was both obvious and revolutionary. As I continued reading, I found in Jonah a fellow explorer, a believer with his eyes wide open, and a man who takes the scriptures seriously, while also keeping his readers awake and engaged with his sense of humor. I agree. I also learned what a gigachad was, which, well, how could you not if you know Jonah Barnes? Over time, I've come to know Jonah not just as a writer, but as a defender of the prophet Joseph Smith and a joyful teacher of restored truth. He doesn't call himself a scholar, and he doesn't need to. But make no mistake, the material he engages with, the ancient texts, apocryphal writings, Second Temple literature, is the same waters scholars of the Bible swim in. What sets Jonah apart is that he brings those waters to the rest of us, making them accessible, filtering them through a Latter-day Saint lens, grounded in the restoration of the Book of Mormon. This book, The Lost Gems of Genesis, continues Jonah's project, one I consider both timely and vital. His mission is clear, to show how the prophet Joseph Smith restored the stories, symbols, and doctrines that were lost from the Genesis account, and to do so by comparing restored scriptures with texts Joseph Smith could not have known. Genesis, as it stands in our modern Bible, like Joseph's coat taken by his brothers and brought to the father Jacob, is misunderstood and torn, riddled with holes. For years, when I taught the Old Testament to college students, they would ask all the right questions, and there are so many of them. Why are there giants in Genesis 6, 1 through 4? And why suddenly does the story skip to God wanting to wipe out humanity? And, by the way, who are these giants? Why does Genesis' account of Enoch have just a couple of the verses informing us that Enoch walked with God and he was not? All without explanation. What's going on in Genesis 22 with Abraham and Isaac? Caustic critics have long used these gaps to undermine faith in the Bible, and by extension, in Christianity itself. Jonah doesn't let that stand. He marshals his deep depository of extra-biblical texts and shows how these, quote, lost gems of Genesis reappear in the revelations of Joseph, most powerfully in the book of Moses and book of Abraham. He demonstrates with striking clarity how Joseph Smith's translation fills in Genesis's breaks in ways that align with ancient traditions unknown in Joseph Smith's day and place. In doing so, he invites readers not just to appreciate these restored texts, but to marvel at the prophetic gift by which they came. And he does all this with a voice that's approachable, even conversational, something very challenging when writing about Scripture. Jonah's writing doesn't require a PhD to enjoy, though it will send you chasing footnotes if that's your thing, which kind of is. If it's relevant, he has funny footnotes. As a huge fan of footnotes and source text, I'm impressed with the work that has been put into this book. Jonah's unafraid to challenge academic gatekeeping and is bold in confronting the arguments of the critics and atheists. He takes the work of the restoration seriously, simply sharing what he's found, inviting us to try the pudding, so to speak. That makes the chapter heading earlier a lot more sense. Try the pudding. To read these restored accounts in light of ancient ones and ask ourselves, what's more likely? That Joseph guessed correctly throughout his writing of the Moses and Abraham, or that he truly was the Lord's prophet? What you'll find in these pages is more than argument or wrestling of sources. It's an invitation to see Genesis with fresh eyes. Jonah's exploration of the sons of God, the Nephilim, and the role of Adam's garment will stick with you long after you put this book down. His analysis of Abraham, particularly the sacrifice of Isaac, will likely cause you to go back and reread everything you have ever read about Abraham and Isaac. And I guarantee you will see this story with a new perspective. Sometimes it takes someone like Jonah to help us unsee what we think we've been seeing so that we can grasp everything anew. It reminds me of the disciples on the road to Emmaus. Only after Christ opened the scriptures to them did they realize how much they had missed. In much the same way, Jonah invites us to reread the familiar texts, especially Genesis, through the lens of Christ. Jonah's core message is the same. Every prophet, from Adam to Lehi, bore witness of Jesus Christ. The truth, so central to the Book of Mormon, also sheds new light on Genesis, showing that Christ has always been the focus of prophetic revelation. Personally, one of the most powerful takeaways for me is how Jonah connects the restored Book of Moses to Lehi's teachings. It never struck me just how much of Lehi's theology was grounded in Genesis, around 2/3, and how much of Lehi's version of Genesis was lost to time, but restored through the prophet Joseph Smith. Jonah even speculates compellingly that the content of the lost manuscript, or what we refer to as the 116 pages, overlaps significantly with what we now call the Book of Moses. Whether or not you accept that conclusion, you'll find his reasoning provocative. In our current climate, where Latter-day Saints, especially those constantly checking social media, face continual attacks on their faith, the need for books like this could not be greater. Social media is flooded with 2-minute takedowns of church history, scripture, Joseph Smith, even faith in God. The Lost Gems of Genesis is a corrective to this corrosion. It speaks to those searching for both reason and revelation. It respects questions, but also points its readers clearly toward Christ. The Lost Gems of Genesis provides many rational reasons for faith. So, whether you're a longtime scripture teacher, a curious reader, or someone wrestling with how Genesis fits into the broader picture of the restoration and wonder what it has to do with Jesus, this book has something for you. You may not agree with every conclusion Jonah draws, but you will finish the book with new questions, new perspectives, and a deeper appreciation for the restoration and the prophetic calling of Joseph Smith. Jonah pulls back the curtain on the lost fragments of Genesis and shows us a broader, more beautiful picture, one that centers on Jesus Christ, illuminates the past, and prepares us for the future day when the promises of Nephi and Moroni will become reality. Dang, that was a great foreword. I'm just saying. It really was. Dramatis Libri. All right, people. In my last book, some of you actually read Dramatis Libri. I had a number of people say they were upset and just couldn't get past the Libri part about the different books. This is troubling. Before you settle in, dear reader, I want you to have the mindset that on the outset that this section is merely an asset to set out what the Apocrypha are. It's just for reference. In other words, refer back here when you need. The below section doesn't make for riveting reading. I think it does. Ish. Well, if anything, to me it gives context. Like, that's the point of me reading the takedown on Pan Enoch. The idea that, oh, it was everywhere. No, it really wasn't. But more importantly, just this gives us context for where did this come from and how does it relate to Joseph Smith in basically saying when was it discovered, how was it there? So yeah, I get it. It's not the most riveting for most people because it's not narrative. But at the same time, to me, it's like, this is context. This is the history. I know sometimes just going through and like, here's the date and here's the location in that kind of history stuff, like if from the professor in Harry Potter who taught history, who was a ghost. It's like, but at the same time, if you actually put it in context, like if you put it on a visual timeline, that kind of stuff is like way cool. Because then you can say, wait a minute, I wonder if this civilization was interacting with that civilization, or if this was here then and that was here then. And I like that context. So even if it may not be the most riveting from a read it to you kind of standpoint, that's why I like doing it and I want to get it all out of the way. So, but let's keep going. In other words, refer back here when you need, and the below section doesn't make for riveting reading, which I objected to. This is a book about the Apocrypha. Right here, up front, I am giving you summary information about the books we're going to talk about. You should probably come back to this later for reminders as to dates and languages, etc. of the books in questions. There are great apocryphal books out there that aren't on this list, but this is a great start. A note on citations. Some of these texts are just that, text. They aren't neatly sliced into chapter and verse like King James Version of the Bible, and in order to properly cite the text, I've just numbered the paragraphs. So in the American Testament of Adam, I pulled from the 4th paragraph, thus I'll cite Armenian Adam verse 4, which means paragraph 4. So there you go. All right, now into his citations. And I'll keep it brief if it starts to get repetitive. All the apocryphal texts, the principal doesn't want you to read. While we want to imagine that all these apocryphal texts emerged from the sands of Egypt like an Indiana Jones film, the truth is, some of them have always been known, just never analyzed, and instead of being discovered, these books were merely brought to the awareness of the broader Western world. The glossary below will describe each apocryphal work cited in this book, identifying each the following information: its name, short citation used in the book, the language in which the book was found and composed, in many cases not the same thing, its provenance and where the book was discovered or noticed, the year the book was discovered or noticed, a description of the contents, and whether it was available to Joseph Smith Jr. in 1829, whether or not it was available to Joseph Smith. Oh, which is just a repetition of what he said. All right. In some cases, e.g. the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, a book contains other books where those are relevant to the discussion in this volume, and they've been noted here. All right, here we go. There's quite a few. We can do this. And I promise, if you don't like this part, you can skip it and you can just go on to the next video, which I'll make in the next day or so. But let's cruise through. We can do it. Apocalypse of Baruch, the son of Nera. It is in Greek. Though canonized in Syriac Orthodox tradition, the Apocalypse of Baruch was only raised to Western awareness after its rediscovery in the Ambrosia Library in Milan, Italy, sometimes called Sectu Baruch. Year 1886, the record of the prophet Baruch, son of Nera, contemporary to Jeremiah, acting sometimes as scribe, and contemporary to Lehi. Baruch receives 2 heavenly visions and witnesses the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem around 586 BC. It is not available to Joseph Smith. Apocalypse of Elijah, Coptic, discovered near the end of the 19th century from St. Chenowit's White Monastery in Upper Egypt. Year 1899, Heavenly Vision and Messianic Prophecies of Elijah, not available to Joseph. Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius. Syriac. Our earliest codex dates to 727 AD, though it is referenced in the ancient world. Many Greek fragments survive though primary text is most complete in Latin and Syriac. Year 2012 for English. Discussion of Genesis with special emphasis on division between Ishmaelites and Isaacites. Not available to Joseph Smith. Apocryphon of John. Greek. Referred to by early church fathers as early as 185 AD, finally raised to modern awareness with the discovery of Nag Hammadi Library, year 1945, the post-resurrection sermon of Jesus to his disciples, which has been added to liberally. This text details a highly complex and strange Gnostic mythology, not available to Joseph. Armenian Adam and Eve and the Incarnation. Language Armenian. The Incarnation was pieced together from 3 manuscripts by Dr. Michael E. Stone, year 1996. The story of Adam and Eve after the expulsion and the covenant of God's condescension and incarnation. Not available to Joseph. Book of Jasher, Hebrew. The Sefer HaYashar means the Book of the Upright, but is frequently mistaken for a proper name, Yasher. The book of Jasher is referenced in the Old Testament twice in Joshua 10:13 and 2 Samuel 1:18. Joseph Smith Jr. commented in the Times and Seasons September 1st, 1842 edition that the book of Jasher has not been disproved as a bad author. The prophet then quoted from the book, and John Taylor also quoted from it. This particular version was translated by Moses Samuel in 1840 and published in Salt Lake City in 1887. Year 1625 in Italian and 1840 in English. Description, a long book recounting the entire pre-Canaan history of the world, from Adam and Eve until the assumption of Moses. Available to Joseph Smith in 1829. No. Book of Jubilees, Hebrew. Though long extant pieces of Ge'ez text in Ethiopia, the antiquity of Jubilees was substantiated when discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran, Jordan. Since its discovery in 1947, 15 scrolls of Jubilees were found in caves at Qumran, suggesting it was widely used there. Year 1947, raised to Western awareness. A variation on much the same events recorded in Genesis, sometimes called Lesser Genesis, Jubilees covers from creation all the way down to Exodus 12. It describes the events in the period of 49 years called Jubilees, hence the name. Not available to Joseph Smith in 1829. And this is funny because I know, Dad, you were talking to me about how you're going through Jubilees, and it was really cool because it had all the other names of like the wives of the different people. So it really helps fills in. And from a genealogist point of view, I would agree that would probably be awesome. I just need to get around to reading it myself. Book of the Bee, Syriac, compiled by Solomon of Aklat, Christian bishop at Barasa, Iraq, written in Syriac. Year 1222 in Syriac, 1866 in Latin, and 1886 in English. A compilation of oral histories from Barasa Christians contains tales of prophecy, prophets, midrash-like commentaries on biblical passages, and lists of rulers. Not available to Joseph Smith in 1829. Book of the Cave of Treasures, Syriac, discovered in Vatican Library by a curious curator. 1711 in Italian, 1835 in German, and 1927 in English. The story of Adam and Eve from the expulsion of the British, the story of Adam and Eve from expulsion to the birth of Christ. Wow, not available to Joseph. Book of Giants, Aramaic, discovered at Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1948. Yeah, big difference. A history of the antediluvians and Enoch's ministry to them before the flood, not available to Joseph. Dead Sea Scrolls, DSS, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, discovered in Qumran, Jordan, hidden for 2,000 years in sealed clay pots, 1946. When the Dead Sea Scrolls are used, it will be presented in translation by Wise, Albed, and Cook from Harper Books, published in 1996, the Dead Sea Scrolls, a new translation. Not available to Joseph Smith. Death of Adam, Armenian, discovered in the library of Mekhithran Monastery, 1896 in Italian and 1900 in English. Summary of events from the expulsion to Adam's death. Not available to Joseph Smith. Discourse on Abaton by Timothy, Archbishop of Alexandria. Wow, that's a title. Sahidic dialect of Coptic Egyptian. Discourse only exists in one manuscript dating to 981 AD, year 1914. On description, an Ask Me Anything session with the resurrected Christ during his 40-day ministry. Nice. That sounds pretty cool. Not available to Joseph Smith. That's pretty cool. Discourse on Abaton by Timothy. Huh. Anyways, Divine Investiture of St. Michael. Old Nubian and Greek, discovered in the monastery of Deir al-Malach Mikhalel in Hamuli, Fayum, Egypt. Year 1910 in English. Very similar to the Discourse on Abaton, Investiture describes a Q&A session between the resurrected Christ and his apostles during the 40-day ministry, which would be nice to have considering that in the Bible it just kind of cuts off. It's like, oh, he's resurrected and nothing! Not available to Joseph Smith. First Enoch, or the Ethiopian Apocalypse of Enoch. The Ge'ez, though probably originally in Aramaic, discovered it by an Abyssinia, Ethiopia, and raised to Western awareness in the early 19th century. Year, 1801 in German, 1821 in London, 1838, Large Order from America, 1833 edition, Preface Lawrence. A History of the Antediluvians Until the Birth of Noah. Not available to Joseph Smith in 1829, as we saw per the appendix. See, it was worth it, wasn't it? Enoch, or Second Enoch, containing a word about Adam and Eve. It was an Old Slavonic, raised to Western awareness, and 1896 was in English, 1997, translation to modern Russian for word, and a description of the ascension of Enoch into the heavens and his visions there. Also a short history of the progeny of Enoch down through the Great Flood. A small portion, still untranslated, appears in a word about Adam and Eve, which was translated into English for the purpose of this book. Yay! Not available to Joe Smith. Enoch, or Third Enoch, Hebrew, raised to Western awareness, 1896 in English. A Heavenly Ascension by Rabbi Ishmael, purported author of the narrative, in which he's given a heavenly tour by Metatron, or Enoch, available to Joseph Smith Jr. in 1829. No, not, because that was much later. Anyways, Genesis Rabbah, Hebrew, long extant in Jewish world. In 1896, it was in English. A Midrash-type exposition on the first 5 books of Moses, not available in 1829 to Joseph. Georgian Book of Adam, which contains the Georgian penitents. The language is Georgian. The Georgian Adam was handed down in 5 manuscripts from the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, originally published into modern Georgian by Siala Kurik Ikidzi in 1964. The Georgian Adam is similar to the Armenian traditions, only in 1996 was the English translation rendered by Dr. Michael E. Stone. In 1964, Georgian. In 1981, French. In 1996, English. The story of Adam and Eve after the expulsion and the covenant of God's condescension and incarnation. Not available to Joseph Smith. Ginza Ruba. Classical Mandaic. Wow, that's a language? Long extant in the Jewish world. 1925 in German and 2011 in English. Not available to Joseph. Anyways, the description is a very long pair of books called the right Ginza and the left Ginza, which are sacred to the Mandaeans. They are a compilation of oral teachings and some written texts handed down among the Mandaean people and textualized as they came. So the composition of the books runs for centuries. Gospel of the Egyptians, Coptic. Although quotations floated around the unidentified, the full text was discovered hidden in a leather-bound papyrus codices known as the Nag Hammadi Library, year 1924. Quotations loosely compiled by M.R. James, 1967 in English. Answers of the risen Lord given to inquiries from the disciples after his resurrection from the dead. Descriptions of Gnostic theology. Not available to Joseph Smith. No way. Gospel of Nicodemus. That makes me wonder, with so many of these Q&A, well, 2 Q&As, and this one being the third for after the resurrected Jesus Christ. That'd be cool to see. Hopefully he goes into that. Wonder how it all pulls together. Gospel of Nicodemus, Greek. Although the oldest manuscripts date from the 9th and 10th centuries, Nicodemus was raised to Western awareness in the 18th century in Italy. The first English translation was translated in 1789 in London. Year 1790, English, London. Description, the descent of the Christ and the harrowing of hell. Available in 1929 to Joseph Smith Jr., though, no way. Yep. This is the history of Abel and Cain, the sons of Adam. That is Armenian. First published in 1896, the Armenian from disparate manuscripts. Year 1896 in Armenian and 1983 in English. The story of the first murder, the punishments of Cain, and the fate of Abel's body. Cool. And if you've been listening to Ward Radio recently, they talk about that kind of stuff. It's cool. It's cool. Anyway. History of John, Armenian history. Language, Armenian, yeah. The original Armenian translation existed early as 1363, but historically was actually quoted in a sermon by Catholicus Zacharias in 877 AD. And year 1954 for English, the history of John's descent into hell, not available to Joseph in 1829. History of the creation of and transgressions of Adam and Eve, Armenian, found and appended to an Armenian version of the Apocalypse of Moses and raised to Western awareness in 1893. In English, the story of Adam and Eve from their expulsion to the promise of the Messianic covenant. Not in 1829, obviously. Kibra Nagast, Ge'ez is the language. First brought to Western awareness in the expedition of James Bruce into Egypt, year 1620s in Portuguese and 1922 in English. History of the world from the creation to the establishment of the Ethiopian Solomonic, yeah. I made that more complicated than it needed to be. Ethiopian Solomonic dynasty. Not available. Joseph Smith. Life of Adam and Eve. Old Slavonic. The Anglicization of the Slavonic is of the author's own making. Ooh, go Jonah Barnes. Discovered in Bulgaria, 1893. The story of the first two, either that or the author who translated it. So whether it was Jonah Barnes or the guy who did it. Anyways, the story of the first 2 weeks after Adam and Eve's expulsion, conflict with Satan, and the covenant of messianic redemption. Not available to Joseph Smith. Life of Adam and Eve, Book 2. Egyptian author wrote in Arabic. Later translations found in Ethiopic. Manuscripts found in Ethiopia dated to the 6th century. In 1882 in English. Sometimes called the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, taken from Ethiopic translator, the Book of Adam and Eve. The first book describes the story of Adam and Eve from the expulsion to Abel's murder. Book 2 describes the story of the patriarchs from the murder of Abel to the translation of Enoch's Zion. Cool. Not available to Joseph in 1829. Life of Adam and Eve or the Apocalypse of Moses. maybe Aramaic or some other Semitic language, now only extant in Greek. Greek life was raised to Western awareness in the late 19th century, and scholars think this version could predate the Latin version by the same name. Year 1913. The life of Adam and Eve from the expulsion to their deaths. Not available, Joseph Smith Jr. Ethiopic, Book of the Mysteries of Heaven and Earth. Originally written in 15th century in Ge'ez, or Classic Ethiopic, and raised to Western awareness in 1935 by E.A. Wallace Budge, and in 1947 in French. A retelling of the feud between Satan and the Archangel Michael. Nuh-uh. For Joseph Smith's availability in 1829. Mandine Enoch, or Livre d'Adam. Mandaic, or Sabine. Reconstructed from 4 Sabian manuscripts found in Imperial Library dating to as early as the 10th century, contained in Migne Yachet Jacques, 1856, Dictionnaire des Apocryphes. My French accent sucks, especially when I'm reading. Oui. Volume 1, page 22 through 288 in French. If the Book of Giants has been called 4th Enoch, then this might be called 5th Enoch. Compiled and translated into French in 1856, the author is unaware of an English translation. Description: these compile the oral traditions of the Christians of St. John. The text described the life and ministry of Enoch, among other things, including the liturgy, sayings, stories of Adam, etc. These are not entitled Book of Enoch, but they provide enough material to reconstruct a narrative comparable to the other books of Enoch. Definitely not available in 1829 to Joseph. Mysteries of St. John the Apostle and Holy Virgin. Coptic. Though long extant in the Coptic Christian community, Mysteries was only raised to Western awareness with E.A. Wallace Budge, translation in the first English edition in 1913. For this publication, the author consulted the original Coptic available at copticscriptorium.org. Ooh, go Jonah Barnes. That's where he got it from. 1913 in English. Description: John the Evangelist sits down with the risen Lord for a Q&A session on the Mount of Olives. Jesus discourses on the creation, the fall, and the plan of salvation. Wouldn't you know? Again, another Q&A session. This is great. Not available to Joseph. Mysteries of Heaven and Earth. Ethiopic Ge'ez. Found in the monastery of Meroe Krestos. Year 1935. English by Perusian. J. Perusian. Purportedly revealed by an angel, this book contains descriptions of creation, Adam, and the antediluvians, and more. Not available to Joseph in 1829. Note, this particular text has been versified by paragraph. The text translated by Perusian has Perusian, has been divided by paragraph and numbered. For example, chapter concerning the muster of divinity, the Father, is annotated as Mysteries v.4, or verse 4 is what I'd put. Old Slavonic Paleia, Ladder of Jacob, Apocalypse of Abraham. Language, Old Slavonic. Provenance from the Old Slavonic Paleia collection of works. The creation of the corpus is unknown, though some scholars suppose it was compiled in Bulgaria in the 9th and 10th centuries. Year 1617, Russian. Description: a retelling of the creation story with midrash-like commentary. Not available to Joseph Smith. Special note on citations: not only has the Old Slavonic Paleia not been translated into English yet, it is yet to be fully translated into Russian as of 2025. For the purposes of the book, the author has translated relevant portions from the Old Church Slavonic and Russian into English. In order to cite these passages, the paper and column will be noted, and each paper has 4 columns, 2 on the front face and 2 on the back face. For instance, P.2a, page 2a, will be used to indicate paper 2, column A, being the second paper in the document, the first column of the 4. Note that these pages are loose pieces, so page 2c indicates third column on the back side of the second paper. Whew. However, one section of Paleia, called Ladder of Jacob, has been translated by Hedley Sparks and divided into proper chapters and verse. This translation will be used for that portion of the Paleia cited thus, wherein the chapter and verse adhere to Sparks' divisions. Whew. Dude, I'm glad there's people smarter than me out there to do that. The Acts of Saint Baracabas of the Valley of the Sacred Avocado? Are you kidding me? The Acts of Saint Baracabas of the Valley of the Sacred Avocado. Please tell me there's some reference to Starbucks in here. And toast. I'm sorry, it's just like avocado? Okay. But that's what it is. Language, wait a minute. I knew it! Language Klingon, Providence discovered hiding in Bob Marley's dreadlocks. Year Y2K. Description, this was put in here to catch you nerds reading through the Dramatis Libre. I'm so grateful somebody did, since it was a lot of work to write. If anyone asks you which apocryphal book is your favorite, be sure to mention this one. They'll be confused, but we'll know. We'll know. So if you are listening to this, and you remember it's the Acts of Saint Baracabas of the Valley of the Sacred Avocado. Yeah! Woohoo! I love it. This is the rewards that Jonah throws in there. Patience of our forefather Adam. Penitence of our forefather Adam. Armenian, a cousin to the primary Adam and Eve literature. Like life books in various languages, penitence has a wholly different provenance. Penitence may have been brought to Yerevan by exiled Nestorian missionaries who ran afoul of the creeds sometime around 590 AD. Modern Armenian, it was 1896, and in 1981 in English, the story of Adam and Eve from the expulsion to the death of Adam. And again, not available to Joseph. Wait a minute. Were the Acts of St. Baracabas in the Valley of the Sacred Avocado available to Joseph Smith? I don't think so. Not in 1829. He didn't put that in. Jonah. Pseudo-Philo. Language Hebrew to Latin. Called Pseudo-Philo after its mysterious author. Even professional scholars have to admit this book was written before the 2nd century AD. The text descends to our present day from the 18 complete manuscripts penned in Latin during the medieval era. Year 1893 in English, a retelling of the Hebrew Bible from Genesis to the death of King Saul. Still not available to Joseph. Romanian Life of Adam and Eve. Romanian, probably translated from Old Slavonic manuscripts, still undiscovered, and raised to Western awareness by Émile Turdinu. Year 1981 in French. Excerpts from the life of Adam. It's so funny how many of these, like, in the 80s, there's a bunch of these that came out, and there were some that just were even more recent than that, so wow. Excerpts from the life of Adam and Eve after the expulsion. Still not available to Joseph. Tales of the Prophets, containing Joseph the Righteous, the story of Adam. Arabic. This record comes from the Qisas al-Anbiya, or Tales of the Prophets, a compilation of Islamic oral traditions compiled by Muhammad al-Qisai around 1100 AD. Year 1893 in English. Stories of the early patriarchs and prophets, including Ada, Shem, Abraham, Ishmael, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Eliezer, Elijah, David, and even Jesus. Folklore is intermixed into the narrative. Nope, not available to Joseph Smith. Testament of Adam and Eve. Language, Ethiopic translation used through perhaps originally in the Syriac. Providence quoted in Greek manuscripts since the 11th century. Testament of Adam and Eve was raised to Western awareness in the late 19th century, because for us, we got it in English in 1927. The retelling of the fall and expulsion by Eve to her son Seth. So Eve's perspective on things. That's cool. Not available to Joseph, of course. And Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, containing Testament of Benjamin, Testament of Jacob, Testament of Joseph, Testament of Levi, Testament of Naphtali, Testament of Simeon. It was Greek, canonized in the Armenian Orthodox Bible, Oscan, in 1666. Patriarchs has long been known among Western scholars, but dismissed as forgeries. Their rediscovery among the Dead Sea Scrolls forced many to revisit their earlier dismissal of the text. Ho, 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 ho! Year 13th century in 1947. English with new credibility. Description, the last testaments and prophecies of the sons of Israel. Available to Joseph Smith Jr. in 1829? Possibly, but highly unlikely. Note on citations, Patriarchs has no chapters and only sections named for each son. Each son's section has no chapters, but verses. So Testament of Levi 5 is referring to Testament of the 12 Patriarchs section of the Testament of Levi, 5th verse. And there you go. The more you know. Testamentum Adamai. Ethiopic, Arabic, and Syriac. The earliest extant manuscript likely dates to the 9th century AD, raised to Western awareness when Bezold published Ethiopic text and Arabic versions in Nodolke's I wish I knew what the umlauts really meant. The Nordiques Festschrift Geisen, 1906, German, if you couldn't tell, and 1927 in English. A short text touching on the creation and the prophecies of Adam concerning the coming of Christ to his son Seth. Not available, Joseph. Really? Okay. So Adam was preaching about Christ to Seth. That's cool. All right. Concerning the good tidings of Seth, to which we ought to give ear. That is the title. Armenian, discovered in the Matandran Museum in Yerevan, Armenia, written on the manuscripts, probably dating to the 17th century. Year 1983. The history of the antediluvian period for the conception of Seth to Noah's landing after the flood. Ooh, but still, no, not available to Joseph. Vitae ade et vee, Eve. Latin. Could have said that better, but then. This was the first primary Adam and Eve literature to emerge in the Western consciousness, if you don't count Joseph's inspired version of Genesis. Based on manuscripts from as early as the 9th centuries, Vita was first published in Munich, Germany, year 1878. Description: the story of Adam and Eve from the expulsion to the death of Eve. No way was it available to Joseph in 1829. Words of Adam to Seth, Armenian, discovered in Matandran Museum in Yerevan, Armenia, written on manuscripts, probably dating to the 17th century. No title is given in the original manuscript. In 1896, it was Armenian. In 1983, to English. It is the last testament of Adam to his heir Seth before his death. Nope, again, to Joseph Smith's availability. The word about Adam and Eve, Old Slavonic. This was the first of the primary Adam and Eve literature to emerge in the Western consciousness, if you don't count Joseph's inspired version of Genesis, based on manuscripts from as early as the 9th centuries. Vita was first publicized in Munich, Germany. Hence, this one came first for the English world. Year 1878. The story of Adam and Eve from the expulsion to the death of Eve. I wonder if that means that Eve lived longer. Anyway. Available Joseph Smith Jr.? No. And there's common abbreviations, such as Hebrew and Aramaic Lexicon of the Old Testament, History of the Church, Journal of Discourses, Joseph Smith Papers, Joseph Smith Translation, Perky, Rabbi, and Teaching of the Prophet Joseph Smith. Okay. We all must remember the Acts of Saint Baracabas of the Valley of the Sacred Avocado. Actually, so that's the conclusion of all the nerdy text stuff, forwards, backwards, upside down words. And I do appreciate it. I know for a lot of people they're just like, but even if you, and I'm glad Jonah injects such good humor to it, because it makes it not only a gem worthwhile, just like his acic no ligaments, anyway, at the very beginning. All those little things actually do add up, and especially for someone who's doing scholarly work, if you have to rely on scholars, it's good to be reliable. But at the same time, if you're not doing scholarly work, but you just still want to get the understanding of where does all this come from? You know, it comes from these specific different regions where both in Ethiopia and north into these areas that are kind of Russian, Armenian, etc. You're like, oh, interesting. Okay, so this is where and why these places have been able to preserve these books, and that's why you find a glut of them in those regions. It gives me context, and it helps you realize that, again, it points out that Joseph Smith didn't have access to all this stuff. And that's a good thing to point out, because that really not only testifies to Joseph Smith as a prophet, but it also, it gives you an appreciation for the fact that when the Book of Mormon was sealed, like, the purpose of having a seal is not just to, like, keep it closed and keep it preserved. It's meant to preserve it from tinkering. Just like you have stamps on a letter, or the seal that was on letters that you had sealing wax for. The idea of keeping it pure was extremely important. And I think that's also a big reason why what we call the lost 116 pages, which if you read the book, The Lost 116 Pages by Don Bradley, you realize it's probably more like 300 pages and practically half of the Book of Mormon. I suspect that wasn't redone specifically, not just because of the whole conspiracy and trying to get him into trouble kind of stuff, but more importantly, it continues to keep things pure, where it is just like, hey, he didn't retread because he wanted to make sure that people weren't going to be confused. Because if you're translating a piece, if you miss a the or at or have a few things slightly different, oh, it wasn't perfect, you're not a prophet. It's like, come on, dude, you're translating. But not only that, it's more along the lines of just keeping it pure, that you just don't have to go, hey, this is straight from the plates to the paper to the manuscript, etc. Like even from going from the manuscript right from the dictation to then the printer's manuscript and the printer having to add in all the punctuation, there's still changes in that. And so arguably, I would say the Book of Mormon is one of the most pure books, but even that, you have to say, people handle this. And that's keeping it sealed. And imagine here you have all these apocryphal works that have been brought down through the ages. Who knows how many people had to re-copy it or make sense of it. Or when they translated it into their language from something that was even more ancient, they updated it to what they could understand. And that's the same reason why the certain parts, as we're going to get into, about the book of Genesis are just kind of weird until you get more information. So, anyways, I know it was a long one. I love going through the nerdy stuff. Hopefully it gives you as much context and enjoyment as it does for me. Hopefully you have a great day, Pa, and anyone else who's listening. So, have a great day.